Chapter 120 of Tehillim is the first of the Shirei HaMa'alot, the Songs of Ascents. Though this category of Perek Tehillim is one that is familiar to many of us, the nature and function of the Shirei HaMa'alot is far from clear. According to Rashi, basing himself on a Mishnah in Perek Bet of Midot, Mishnah Hay, the Shirei HaMa'alot were the Psalms that the Levium would recite on the 15 steps leading from the men's section to the women's section in the Mikdash. The Gemara, commenting on this Mishnah, in Mesachat Sukkah, on Daf Nun Gimel, recounts that David HaMelech recited these Perek Tehillim in order to raise up the waters of the abyss that had been displaced and had sunk down when the foundation stone for the Mikdash had been laid. Building off of these opinions, Amos Chacham, in his Dan Mikra commentary, suggested it is possible that the Shirei HaMa'alot were recited during the Simchat Beit HaShoeva ceremony on Sukkot, when they would draw water in an effort to get the abyss to rise up and irrigate the earth, ensuring a productive agricultural year for Bnei Yisrael. There have been other suggestions offered as to the meaning behind the phrase Shirei HaMa'alot. Saadia Gaon and the Meiri both think that it might connote not the setting of the songs, but rather the type or the manner in which that they were sung, namely that they were sung in a high melody or in a progressively louder voice. Alternatively, the word ma'alot might be a reference to the structure of the psalms, which have certain words and expressions repeated in them. So ma'alot might be some sort of category or meant to connote the nature of the psalms, namely psalms that have certain words repeated in a certain structural pattern. Others suggest that the phrase doesn't refer to the melody or the structure of the songs, but rather to their setting. The setting, however, that they suggest is not one at the time of David HaMelech, but is rather at a later time. Namely, it could be that these Shirei HaMa'alot were recited by those who were Oleh back to Eretz Yisrael, namely those returning to the land after the Babylonian exile. So they were Oleh back to the land. The songs that they sung were Shirei HaMa'alot, or these songs possibly were sung by Israelites who were being Oleh L'Regel. Again, Oleh L'Regel being the same root word as Ma'alot, Shirei HaMa'alot, and those who are Oleh L'Regel. Alternatively, these songs might have been sung by those who are bringing Korban Olahs. So again, Olah, Shir HaMa'alot, and Korban Olah, that same shorish there being the connection between the category of Shirei HaMa'alot and the bringing of the Korban Olah. With regards to Psalm 120 specifically, besides the opinions as to what types of category this psalm fits in, what Shirei HaMa'alot as categories were and what their settings were, there's also much disagreement over what Psalm 120 is with regards to the background. Namely, there are three opinions as to what style this psalm is. The first is that this shir, which begins Shir Ma'alot El Hashem Batzarata Li Karati V'Aneni, a song of ascents. In my distress I called to God, and He answered me. And then continues to describe the Sfat Sheker and Lashon Ramiyah, people with lying lips and deceitful tongues who plague the psalmist. So this can be read in any of three ways. One is that the psalmist is recalling an answered prayer of his past at a time of trouble, meaning he's telling us, there was a time when I called out to God, and He answered me when I had called to Him about these deceitful people who are my enemies. And basically it's telling us about something that had happened in the past. A second alternative way of reading it is that the psalmist had been answered a previous time by God, Karati V'Aneni. He's telling us that at some undefined point in the past, God had answered him when he called out, when the psalmist called out to God. And now the psalmist is calling out to God a second time in a new context for a different trouble, this new trouble of these deceitful people. Alternatively, the third choice is that the psalm is written in real time, in the sense that the psalmist is telling us as this ailment is afflicting him, as these deceitful enemies are fighting him, he's saying, I am calling out to God now. Why? Because there are these enemies with deceitful tongues that are afflicting me. So it's possible to read the psalm as referring completely to the past, or referring to a previous incident where God had provided salvation for the psalmist, and now the psalmist is crying out again a second time. Or alternatively, it can be in present tense in real time, with the psalmist recalling, or not recalling, with the psalmist stating his feelings as they occur. And in fact, the latter position is the position that Amos Chacham in his Dan Mikra commentary takes, namely that the psalmist is telling us his feelings as they occur. The psalm then goes on to say after the first verse, Hashem Hatzila Nafshi Misvat Sheker Melashon Ramiyah. after those first two verses, rather, God, the psalmist says, God, save me from those of lying lips and deceitful tongues. In the next verse, the psalmist flings verbal vengeance at those who have been trying to deceive him, saying, what will he, referring to Hashem, give you, and what will he add to you, O deceitful tongue? Meaning, the psalmist is telling his attackers, God is going to get you, and you have punishment coming your way. So the question is a rhetorical one. What will he give you? Namely, he will give you punishment. He, God, will punish you of deceitful tongues. The next verse can be read one of two ways. The verse says, according to Robert Alter, this reference to sharp arrows of the mighty with coals of broomwood is a reference to the aforementioned deceitful enemies of the psalmist. Namely, the psalmist is telling us that their deceitful tongues are sharp like arrows, and they burn hot like wood that is on fire. According to Amos Chacham, however, this verse is an elaboration of the punishment that the psalmist had just asked God to bring upon his enemies. Basically, in a midah keneged midah way, the psalmist is asking God to bring sharp arrows of the mighty to combat the sharp tongues of his enemies. In fact, Chacham raises the possibility that the psalmist is asking for a twofold punishment, namely that these sharp arrows would come from human hands, human enemies that would defeat the enemies of the psalmist, and these coals, this hot fire would come from heaven, would come from God, possibly even in the form of lightning from heaven striking down the enemies of the psalmist. The psalmist continues his prayer by lamenting that he has sojourned in Meshech and dwelled in Kedar, places extremely far from each other. Seemingly, the psalmist is referring to long travels he has had to make in order to get away from his lying and deceitful enemies. Robert Alter, in fact, raises the possibility that these two places, Meshech and Kedar, were so far from each other that the psalmist here is being hyperbolic because there is no way that one individual could have wandered so far from Meshech to Kedar. It could be that the psalmist is exaggerating for effect the travels and travails he has had to go through due to his trying to avoid his enemies. The psalmist then continues and says that his soul has long dwelt with people who hate peace. Rabat shachna ala nafshi im soneh shalom, but ani shalom v'chia daber hema lemelchama. I, the psalmist, am for peace, but they, my enemies, they are for war. When I speak for peace, but when they speak for war. So the psalm thus ends on a negative note, namely the mention of war. The psalmist says, Ani shalom, I am for peace, or I am peace, but my enemies are for war. So the psalmist here expresses his identification with the theme or with the value of peace, similar in fact to a previous Perek of Tehillim 109, where the psalmist says, Vani tefilati, I am my prayer. Could mean I am for prayer, or I am my prayer, or I am offering a prayer. So to here, there seems to be a conflation, a purposeful conflation between peace and the psalmist. The psalmist says, Ani shalom v'chia daber himalam l'chama. I am peace. I am for peace when I speak, but my enemies are not. My enemies are for war. So thus, while the psalm ends on a negative note, it is possible it's meant to continue on structurally to the next psalm, Tehillim Kuf Chaf Aleph, which we know we often recite in times of trouble, because it says, Esa inai el haharim me'ayin yavo ezri me'im Hashem oseh shamayim va'aret. God, the creator of heaven and earth, is the one who provides me with salvation, and he is the one who rescues me. So it could be that Tehillim Kuf Chaf was placed purposefully before Kuf Chaf Aleph, which continues on to express who it is, namely Hashem, who rescues the psalmist who is in trouble. So it could be that the negative note of Kuf Chaf Aleph is meant to continue on the positive note that begins. So the negative note of Kuf Chaf is meant to continue on to the positive note that begins Kuf Chaf Aleph, namely answering the question of who is to provide this salvation, who is to rescue the psalmist from Milchama. The answer, of course, is that Hashem is the one to rescue him, Hashem who is Oseh Shamayim Va'aretz. As we know, Aunt Sara was someone who brought shalom, who brought peace to those whose minds compelled them to make war. As Uncle Josh spoke about at her funeral, she would go out of her way to bring peace and a calming presence to those struggling with their mental health, to those fighting mental battles. She went the extra mile to calm them and to cheer them, be it through a multicolored email full of jokes of questionable appropriateness and or exclamation points or lots of colors, to a wall-to-wall smile, or completing a prescription for someone who needed some extra pillin. She made it her mission to bring peace to those fighting their own personal wars. And while she might have succumbed to her own milchama, her own war with cancer, she left us with a legacy of shalom, of peace. Ani shalom. Aunt Sara truly embodied the value of peace, and she fought against those who would sling verbal arrows, at people she felt should not have verbal arrows slung at them. She would not take insults that she felt were not justified to those that she knew and to those that she loved. And she was a defender of peace, and she was a bringer of shalom. And she brought such a calming, peaceful presence to those who fought their own milchama, and she defeated those fighters. She defeated them with peace. So, in my mind, that is a true reflection of Aunt Sara, her ability to bring those calming words, those peaceful words, to those who knew her. And these Shirei HaMalot, whatever the original explanation for this categorization is, the Shirei HaMalot might be a perfect representation of Aunt Sara in that they are Ma'alot, they are uplifting, they are on high. And Aunt Sara was someone who really brought people to such a spiritually high level, whether it be through laughter, through tefillah, through singing, through joyful recollection of memories, be they of camp, be they of family occasions, of occasions with friends. She was someone who brought people to the highest of heights, and that, I think, is a true testament to her legacy, that what she embodied is really personified so well in the psalmist who brought peace to those who might struggle with war, who might struggle with their own battles. And Sarah truly was one who brought them means of salvation and who brought them peace.